Hey, good morning, friends and family. I just wanted to give you an update on how the election inspecting went yesterday, given the photo I had posted yesterday. Thank you to everyone who watched yesterday's video or felt it said something important enough that you ended up sharing it with others. I really appreciate that. So I worked at the election site at Riverside High School here in Milwaukee yesterday. And that site, if you were paying attention to news, I believe was the one that most news outlets were showing the long lines at. We ended up having the most voters of any of the five election sites in Milwaukee yesterday. I think the number was 3,914. It was over 3,900 people. And that was just a few voters higher than a couple of the other sites. Most of them had, I think all of them had relatively the same number, and Riverside happened to have the most. I can't really put those numbers in context for you because Milwaukee normally has 180 voting sites, or actually over 180 voting sites. And yesterday, because of the consolidation and the number of people who were available to work, there were only five. Additionally, this was a spring election as opposed to a November general election. And so the voting numbers are, with all the absentee ballots, are just very different. What I can comment on is what was being done in terms of trying to keep people safe versus just the inherency of an unsafe situation. All of the election inspectors, election workers yesterday wore masks and had gloves. Now, majority of the inspectors yesterday also had clothes coverings, white gowns that they received. I ended up coming in the afternoon shift, and I think those gowns were given out for those who had started right away at 6 a.m. As it turned out, when I arrived, I ended up coming in a side door when I checked in, and so I wasn't provided a gown. And when I was being checked in by a Milwaukee Health Department nurse who was working, took my temperature, gave me a mask and gloves. The first thing she said to me was, "You do know that all of your clothes are now considered contaminated, right?" Which I knew was going to be the case when I went in anyway, but it was certainly an interesting comment to start a 10, 11-hour shift of working, where it's like, yep, everything I am currently wearing, we just have to assume is going to have COVID on it or has already. As to the actual process of voting yesterday. So I worked mostly as a person checking in registered voters, or what's called a runner, which is a person who, in this instance, would go get ballots for voters. So the process, easily to describe, is a voter would come in. If they were already registered, they check in with me or another worker at a registration table. If they hadn't been registered, they would go to a different set of tables to get registered, or if they were registered but needed to change an address or a name, that sort of thing. They would then sign a piece of paper that served as our poll book to say, yep, I am who I say I am, after checking their address and their ID. And then the runner would go and get one of the ballots for their particular ward for the voter. Each voting site had over 60 wards at it. So there was the option of our ward had over 60. So there is that many different options for ballots for an individual voter. So every time a voter came up, after they were done checking in and getting their ballot to move on to the privacy booths to vote, the table that we were working at would be wiped down. Every worker, as I said, had masks and gloves, and any voter who came up and who didn't have some sort of writing device like a pen would be provided a pen to them. This then became their pen. They took it with them and took it home. We did not take them back as a way to try and prevent cross-contamination. I believe the number I read in the Journal Sentinel earlier this week was that 1 million pens were ordered for this purpose, which I think was a statewide number. Might have been a Milwaukee County only number, but I believe was a statewide number. Most voters wore masks voluntarily. They just came wearing masks. And the site itself, so once you got into the building, the floor was spiked every 6 feet to try and keep social distancing in one of those weaving Disneyland-like lines. We had at least a table or two separation between the person checking them in and the voter itself. And then all of the voting booths were separated 6 feet apart as well. So a lot of the length of the line in terms of actual distance was because of the 6 foot separation between people. That said, all of these measures taking place to try and prevent the further spread of COVID-19 during this pandemic was not inherently safe. The Wisconsin legislature and the Wisconsin Supreme Court created a mass gathering at Riverside of over 4,000 people and created mass gatherings around the state where Wisconsinites were not safer because they were not at home. I have seen some claims out there, most prominently by Speaker Voss, that voting yesterday was safer in terms of trying to prevent the spread than other activities people have been taking recently, such as grocery shopping. That statement is inherently misleading because, yes, all of the actions that I have previously mentioned were taken to try and prevent the spread of COVID-19. I have been grocery shopping in the last week, and I have seen measures taken by workers at my local grocery store, which I used to work at, to also limit the spread of COVID-19. I would argue it is harder to prevent the spread of COVID-19 at a grocery store, but that's because of its greater size and greater complexity of interaction. And the difference between voting in person at an election site and buying groceries is people have to eat and people have to buy groceries. People don't have to vote in person. And continuing the process of voting in person is not safer because it creates environments to spread, while grocery stores are going to continue to exist regardless of the situation. That also said, I was amazed by the resilience of voters yesterday. Many provided thanks. There were also many who were angry at the situation. I don't think there was a single person that I saw or that I interacted with, a voter, that was angry at any of us as election inspectors yesterday, and that was amazing. I also saw people who, despite Herculean efforts, were still unable to vote. The average that I heard from people who we were talking with when they would come up to check in was that they had waited in line about 2 hours. That number, I think, varied throughout the day, but most of the people I heard said it was about 2 hours. I had one voter come up to me and said, I realized as I was in line with, my friends, obviously separated, waiting to vote, that I don't have an ID on me that has my photo on it. Is there any way, and he showed me what he had on him, that could work? And the items that he had on him did not meet the requirement of a photo ID. He then didn't vote. There was another person who had spent around 2 hours in line who spent that time and then realized that they were at the wrong voting location, which is understandable given, everyone was voting in a different location. As it turned out, it was just before 8 o'clock, and there was basically next to no chance that that individual could get to the other high school that they needed to be at in time to be in line before the polls closed. Because if he had been in line at 8 p.m., he would have given the chance to vote. Herculean efforts were made to try and make this work well. That still creates situations where people were unable to vote because of the sheer in-person nature of the changing space. Another thing I saw reported in the paper that Milwaukee did not have curbside voting. Did not have drive-up or drive-through voting. That is technically true, but I wanted to let everyone in Wisconsin know that we do have curbside voting throughout the state, which is if you are an individual who has a disability or otherwise it is difficult to physically come into a voting location, you can have someone bring a ballot out to you. And all the same procedures are followed, except it's just out at your car as opposed to coming in. That is true with all elections. That is not something new for this one. So if you fall into one of the categories where that is the case, you can have curbside voting. Interesting things to comment on. Given all of the election inspectors were wearing masks the whole time, when we would go back for breaks, to eat food, which was very nicely provided by organizations and businesses throughout the day. You have to take your mask down to put food in your mouth, and you would look around, people at a distance from you, and basically have to re-meet everyone because now everybody looked different, which was pretty fun. And in terms of the actual outcome, I mentioned that we had the most voters, but results of the vote per federal lawsuit order will not be reported, I believe, until next Monday, the 13th. I believe that has to be after 4 p.m., but I do know that the reporting has been delayed until then. So we'll know the results of all of this voting once all of the absentee ballots have been counted, and that reported next week. That's my update. Today begins day one of my self-quarantine, because as I mentioned, despite the fact that I feel fine going in, and I currently feel fine right now, with potential incubation period, I don't want to be unintentionally, inadvertently spreading whatever I may have come into contact yesterday, even with all of the precautions taken. So for the next 14 days, I will be in my house. Thankfully, I have a job that allows me to do that. I know not everyone is as privileged in that regard. Thank you all. Love you, and talk to you when I talk to you.